Good morning and welcome to another episode of the Microsoft 365 Government Community Call. My name is Jay Leask, and with me as usual, two of our other four, well, I can't speak today, Jeremy Wood and Rima Reyes. Jeremy, Rima, great to see you both.
You too. Love the hat.
Thank you. My parents got me for this. This is one of the two tartans for the Leask family, and I wore it this morning to go pick my daughter up from swim, and then I realized, hey, when I wear a hat, like I have to wear it all day or my hair is a disaster. Mom's like, you're inside now, right? I'm like, I know, and I'm recording, just leave me alone. Anyway.
All good.
That's awesome.
It's all good.
All right. Well, I'm very excited for today. We've got a really great show. We're going to get into data security a little bit with our guest. And unfortunately, Sarah's on a cruise today. If I remember
correctly. She's on a really great cruise. Party.
That's
she's
exciting.
Having a blast. Yeah.
So, well, here we are, the three of us. Let's jump right in. Jeremy, you want to hit the community events up?
Yeah, first, a couple that we just missed because where our episode falls in the month. The NARA user group just met, and they had Erica Toll from Microsoft come and give an update on some really great feature changes in the compliance. And we are looking, hopefully, here in the near future to have her come talk about those as well, because the NARA meeting is only available to government, and it's not recorded. So we can double team and get that same content. Also, on March 9th, the Microsoft 365 user group DC did a Power BI analysis and paralysis session that you all just missed. But their next meeting will be April 13th. Today, March 14th, there's a civilian Microsoft Business Application Summit. Maybe I'll see somebody there. And tomorrow is the DoD version of that, and there's still time to register for that. So
I just like that with the magic of recording, Jeremy is in both places at once.
You may see me at that event.
Yes.
But the DoD one is tomorrow, and so this is focused on Power Pages, Power BI, and of course Dynamics, and all those things that fall into the business applications segment of Microsoft's business.
Yeah, it's a busy week thanks to the magic of recording. I'm also not here today. I am at the AvePoint Customer Advisory Council session here in Arlington. But tomorrow, March 15th, we're kicking off, AvePoint and Microsoft are kicking off our Power Platform management and governance at scale workshops, which the 15th is it's in DC, it's in the Arlington MTC. So if you haven't signed up for that, check out our website here and you can join us. We're also going to be in New York City on the 23rd, Seattle on the 28th, and then have stops in Dallas, Denver, Houston, Atlanta, Chicago, and Irvine, California, all scheduled through, I want to say into May. So if you are struggling with how do we enable Power Platform, how do we enable the users of our environment with Power Platform, but still control what they're able to do, how they're able to do it, identify when it goes from personal productivity to actual needing professional development processes. That's what we're going to be talking about. So that'll be a lot of fun.
Hold on a second. I got to take a note. You need to send me the link to that event.
Of course. And then we'll see you tomorrow, Jeremy. And then we also have the Microsoft 365 meetup for government coming up. They haven't announced the topic yet, but that is typically the last week of the month. So check out the link in the chat, as long as somebody's watching the chat today, to be able to get to their meetup and sign up to subscribe when those happen.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. Okay, so let's talk about roadmap. So in the last month, Microsoft has been a busy bee. We've released about 34 items that have actually been launched. So they're in production, so you should be able to see them. So now in Teams, you can @mention everyone. So if you're in a group chat or if you're in a Teams channel, if you write and then write the word everyone, it'll actually mention everyone. So that's rolling out right now. We also have Outlook suggested replies, which is rolling out to DoD, which is awesome. I love those. I use those all the time when I'm like in the morning, like looking at my Outlook in bed, and I'm like, I'm too tired to type, right? So those are pretty good. We also have custom calendars in Microsoft Project for Web, and that's available in all GovClouds. We also now have task email notifications for Planner. Huge, right? I can't tell you how many times I've missed
Yeah.
if they don't also email me. Like I need both places, so that's super important.
And
Um,
that's rolling into GCC High specifically, so it's not
Thank
quite
you.
in everything yet.
Thank you. Yes,
Mhm.
GCC High. Yeah, DoD, you're coming next. Don't worry. Stream also is adding embed codes for internal websites, and that's available in all GovClouds. And then for Purview, the compliance portal now allows you to hide the preservation hold library from
Big
all
deal.
sites. Huge deal. Thank you. Yes, Jeremy. But again, available in all clouds. Also available in all clouds, you can add a new disposition review progress column for all approved items. And then we also have endpoint DLP for Mac OS. Again,
Yep.
all clouds. So I know Mac OS is popular for some folks. I know my dad, who's in NASA, he loves Mac.
Nope.
He's like, no, it's not public. Well, he's an engineer. He built satellites. I guess they do it in Mac. I don't know. I don't know. It's weird. We also have the Office apps replacement for the M365 app. That's again available in all clouds. So you'll see a new logo there too. And then we also have dictation rolling out to DoD via all the Office apps. So again, super big thing. I love dictation. It saves a lot of time and a lot of typing.
Yep.
My fingers and hands get tired.
Control H is the keybind.
There you go.
Ooh,
There you go.
good tip.
There were also 74 items added to the roadmap last month, and 2 of them are rolling out as we speak. So they were added and started rolling out immediately, which is actually, well, we won't talk about whether or not that's scary. The 2 topics I'm going to focus on, Purview and Viva. From Purview, data lifecycle, the ability to scope administration of retention labels. The ability to scope a user to the space of that they're supposed to be running retention labels on, like an office records manager, rather than doing it tenant wide, they're scoping it down to a content area. Can't speak. And retention actions are rolling out to Power Platform. Those are both rolling out in July. The retention scoping is GA in August. Whereas the Power Automate retention will roll out GA in July. E-discovery for Teams meeting recordings and videos should roll out in July. Recommended action enhancements should roll out in May, and e-discovery export APIs should roll out in March for preview and April for GA. I imagine that has something to do with the desire to connect your records exports directly to NARA, but I haven't dug into that enough to know for sure. Maybe we can talk to Eric about that next month.
Yeah, I would point out, interestingly enough, that preview is creeping into the GovClouds. It's only at the GCC level, so you can get some preview functionality at the GCC. They haven't rolled that out for GCC High or DoD yet, but you never know. And I wanted to comment how much there were. I mean, I'm looking at that list. There's a ton of them that said all.
Yes.
Microsoft's getting really good at getting them up to all the clouds at once, which is phenomenal.
When you do security by design, you can do that. Like getting developers to change from I'm going to develop something and then I'm going to add security into I'm going to build security into what I'm developing has been a huge change. But when you do that, all of those features I just announced going straight to all 3 clouds. Not going to all 3 clouds, going back to the Viva conversation, we have trending topics to be included in Viva Topics. That should come out to GCC in June. We have the topics bot in Teams should be rolling out to GCC in May. We have bot support for Viva Connections cards rolling out to GCC in March. So maybe by the time this recording goes out. And Connections should roll out to GCC High in March. So we have a number of things on the Viva side starting to spread spread in GCC and spread out into GCC High. Like you said, that's a big deal. Yep.
Yeah, now we're talking news from the community. Sarah would normally cover this because she is the public sector lead for the tech community. So I'm going to highlight just 3 articles. There was an event here in the DC area, FedMake Focus on civilian government, and they met and talked about how to meet your mission with no and low code solutions. So they put out a blog article on that. There is also an article where Microsoft's tooting their own horn a little bit, but it's kind of cool. They've successfully completed their voluntary CMMC assessment, which we know a lot of people care about that security aspect. Our guest actually cares about that as well. So that's a big deal. And then just as a note, they put these out monthly at the end of the month. The February 2023 M365 U.S. Public Sector Roadmap newsletter is out, and they highlight some of those things we just talked about, but in more depth as far as what rolled out into the public sector clouds.
Yeah. Interesting note about that that completion of the voluntary CMMC assessment. Man, I made fun of you.
None of us can say it.
And then I did it. Anyway, they scored a perfect score, which...
Whoa.
Right? Yes. I mean, there's something to be said about that.
My funny bone's twinging a little bit.
Anyway, before we make Rima uncomfortable and get ourselves pulled from the Microsoft airwaves.
Yes. Thank you. So now we're actually going to move to our interview portion of the show. We have Ryan Bonner here, who is the founder and CEO of DEFCERT, where he has led DFARS and CMMC compliance transformation projects for over 150 manufacturers in the defense industrial base, the DIBS. His team specializes in designing CMMC implementation plans for small and medium-sized manufacturers, OEMs, and commercial space companies. Welcome, Ryan.
Hey, thanks for having me, everyone.
Yeah, Ryan, very excited to have you. Sarah was adamant that we should talk with you. She's as the lead of the public sector community, you know, she has her pulse on everybody who's out there. And we were trying to figure out who can we talk to about security in Microsoft 365. And she has mentioned your name quite a few times. So thank you for joining us. Kick us off with this. When it comes to Microsoft 365, when it comes to data security in Microsoft 365, what are government and regulated industries' biggest challenges?
Yeah, I think some of the big challenges that we're seeing is that the biggest regulatory footprint, I guess you could say, for data, especially when we see this in the private sector and in the contracting base, is a lack of uniformity or understanding in what makes something regulated data. How do I know when received information is regulated in certain ways? And how do I start to manage that data through business processes? Because, you know, those business processes, to use all of the CMMC parlance, you know, people, assets, information assets, technology, and facilities, they're all now somehow involved in meeting the regulatory burden or regulatory requirements for that data. And, you know, there's different requirements to meet all at the same time for even just a single document or data set. So that could be a real challenge for organizations when they step into this government space, because, you know, there's a really clear understanding around things like PHI or PII or credit card numbers or any of the other things that we would normally talk about or think about in everyday business. You move into this space and it's much more nuanced and contextual.
Yeah. I mean, AvePoint, for the longest time, we have a tool that scans your content and looks, using regular expressions, looks for any kind of string or pattern to recognize and say, this is PHI, this is credit card information, this is a social security number. And you're right, like as CUI, well, as sensitive information came up, and now CUI being the big topic of the day, I'll refer to it as, like, it becomes much harder. It's not just a pattern that we can identify. It is business context, right? It's a much more nuanced thing that people are trying to figure out.
Absolutely. And, you know, you'd even mentioned, you know, oh, sorry, I meant to say sensitive, but now it's CUI. You know, we've got a total alphabet soup going on here. I mean, you've got SBU or, you know, for official use only. And now I think sometimes that might be CUI. And the DoD calls it covered defense information or DoD technical information or unpublic, not, or what is it? Unclassified, non-public defense information, UNDI.
Yes.
Like, what are we dealing with here? There's so many different ways to deal with it. And then when you get into the, you know, the CUI registry, everything's got a different banner marking or short code, and it's like, you know, collecting Pokemon.
Yeah. I just had to redo my training on CUI. It's like, where should it be in the banner, in the footer? What goes along with it? And I'm like, oh man, I do remember, like, because I've been in that particular space for a little while. Like, I remember there was the combination of strings, the, you know, SEC, FOUO, Five Eyes, like the list of things, and now we're down to what is CUI?
Yeah, and I think the original goal there was to consolidate a lot of those requirements into a more uniform way of marking and safeguarding and handling information. But in doing so, I feel like a lot of the context behind the scenes that allow us to understand why something is CUI was sort of obfuscated. I take people through this practice all the time. I say, when you go into the CUI registry, what do you read to determine what CUI is? And they'll say, well, I read this little description here for the category. And I'm like, well, that's a description of the overall category. And then we have them scroll down and look at the dissemination authorities and say, we have to go here. We have to go clicking into laws and regulations and see exactly what is under the hood. And then that's usually where, we can gain some understanding.
So let's, if you don't mind, because I'm, I guess, a little dumb in this area. I've also been a little bit out of the game a little bit for this like marking information and stuff like that. So like, what is CUI, and why should Rima or anybody here who's listening care? Like, why is it important?
It's a great question. I think that when you ask people that question, a lot of the time they'll start to describe the characteristics of CUI, and they won't be able to tell you what it actually is. And I think the reason for that is that most people don't go back to the source, which is NARA. NARA is the executive agent for the CUI program. And when they established the program, they defined CUI at the highest level. So just to walk you through it, in Part 2002 of 32 CFR, which is the CUI program itself, NARA tells us that controlled unclassified information is information that the government creates or possesses, or that an entity creates or possesses for or on behalf of the government. But whichever of those is true, it's always information that a law, regulation, or government-wide policy either requires an agency to safeguard or control the dissemination of that information, or permits them to go enforce controls over those same things. So in order to better understand CUI, it's good to know that it's always information that there was an existing law or regulation in place. And so when you ask, why should I care? Well, these regulations have already existed. These laws have already existed. And so in determining CUI, we actually become better students of the laws and regs that were already imposed on us and we maybe weren't paying enough attention to.
So basically, I don't want to be taken away in handcuffs is kind of what.
Yeah, sometimes I feel like if you've ever seen the movie Goodfellas, Jimmy Conway, when he's asking, is it Lauren Bacall to go back? Just keep going. No, the next door, keep going. As you go and you read these authorities, you're like, oh my gosh, am I walking to my doom?
Yes, yes, you are, by the way.
Yes. Yeah, you're reading about all these laws and regulations. Some of them have sanctions and penalties mentioned and stuff like that. And so it's really important to get a handle on this, because nothing in the CUI registry is a net new requirement. We are having safeguarding requirements added to it, right? Like with NIST 800-171, and that'll be certified in CMMC. But the fact that it applied to us was always the case. So organizations who don't know that CUI is necessarily going to include things like export controlled information is really important to understand, because now this is a more appropriate bucket, if you will, to put certain kinds of information into.
So how does this? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say something on the NIST thing. So that always tweaks me a little bit, because it's so funny that NIST is not a regulatory body, right? They are putting out guidance, and I think there's a trick there. You have to know what NIST is putting out, but then you also have to know, but who is telling us we have to do what NIST is saying, right? There's like this catch. It's never in the same place. Like NIST is never touting it necessarily. Hey, by the way, so-and-so says you need to care that I put this out, right? It's this always, you got to pay attention to this other entity. So for example, with the recent OMB memo around secure software development practices and the software attestation, right? NIST has a whole guide on what is secure software development practices. But the law over here is what's actually telling you to care that they have that guide. And it's kind of this weird dichotomy.
It's like the what and the why, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a constant game of putting together all the people saying all the things and then saying, oh, this is the actual ask from government, or the requirement from government. I go get my standard from NIST. I get the applicability from NARA. and then a contract clause somewhere sort of rolls it all up, and I have to go backtrack all of that to find out what's going on.
Yep.
So how is like how is CUI essentially protected in M365? Like how is this all kind of connected? How does it work?
Sure. Well, we have to think about how good practices around data management would be just supported by things like M365 tools. So when we talk with a lot of organizations, there's almost always two concurrent efforts that are going on. One is to identify net new controlled and classified information that you receive from organizations or customers or agencies on future projects or future contracts and solicitations. And that's where you have the most control over understanding whether the data is CUI and then choosing to manage it correctly with M365 tools. Then there's the second effort, which is going back into legacy data sets you've been receiving for some time and trying to somehow repeat that process at scale. And so it's always trying to figure out what's the best tool for the job. So when we talk about organizations getting data up front, we want to get the M365 tool usage as close to the people doing contract reviews as possible. And the reason we say that is because you're most often going to be creating new documents that didn't exist before as contract deliverables on a government contract. And then now you've got to determine whether or not those are going to be considered CUI by the way they're described in the contract. So when you get the contracts management people notating that as they do other necessary contracts reviews during negotiation, that's the moment where you can say, I have these 16 deliverables, 4 of them are considered CUI, or whatever that thing is. That's the perfect time to do some other best practices that we talk about a lot, like creating brand new Office documents with the correct markings already on them, and then putting a sensitivity label on them, perhaps using Microsoft, Purview information protection at that moment, so that the document is already in the right posture and already protected before you put your first piece of regulated content into it. So those are some things that we push for a lot. We also are really keen on things like service-side labeling, because if we want people to just be able to take a whole technical data set they just got and put it in the right place and have it inherit all the right sensitivity labels and protections, that could be an excellent tool to then have a data steward come in and say, oh, well, these 2 documents actually technically aren't, and then take the label off rather than trying to put it all on later at different times. So that's a big part of it. But then I think also you're going to get into that batting cleanup phase, if you will, on old legacy data sets. And that's where we like to see organizations think about putting old data into like an archive mode, and then repeating the process we just mentioned for data when we get a new award or renewal of a contract, because we'll treat it like brand new data, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's a couple things that you said on there that really kicked me. One being the ability to take the label off of something when we've decided it isn't CUI. That's an approach that AvePoint takes to sensitive data. When we look at workspace management teams and SharePoint sites, for example, if you know something's going to have export control data in it, if a team is going to have export control data in it, don't let people who aren't allowed to see export control data in the team. Like, start there, and then you can declassify is the wrong term, but then you can expand who can see that particular piece of information when you've confirmed it's okay. I really like that approach, and Microsoft does make that does give you the ability to define those kinds of things, the way it's structured with teams and SharePoints and libraries and all of that. So I liked that comment a lot. And the other thing you said that hit home was talking about that legacy data. You mentioned, the 2 work streams, identifying net new information. Does this have CUI in it? But then you have to do that effort to go back and look at your old data. So my question for you on that is, when you go back and look at old data, are people expected to look at that old data with today's regulatory standards and say, today this would be considered CUI, therefore we're going to put the CUI classification on it? And the reason I'm asking that is because the ramification is 10 years from now, they're going to have to do the same exercise with that data, looking at that time frames, regulations. Love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So like one of the things we should keep in mind is that the DoD has just revised their own instruction set for CUI. which is really helpful for us to see the patterns that maybe we should go through ourselves. So if you're not familiar, there's a DoD instruction called 5230.24, and it used to be just titled something like distribution statements and how to apply them and things like that. Now it's just titled DoD technical information, and the DoD actually comes right out and says, hey, if you have a document and it has DoD distribution statements B through F on it, it's CUI. That's the end of the story. But they give themselves options on how they want to move forward with that. They said, hey, for new information, you do now have to add a CUI designation indicator and all the right markings to a document, in addition to the DoD distribution statement we've been putting on documents since the 1980s. But you don't have to go back and do that right now for everything. You do, however, have to do it before you disseminate it again. So things sitting on the government's hard drive don't need to be necessarily sought out and remarked in mass, but you do have to remark before you disseminate it the next time. So things like that are maybe good policy benchmarks, I guess, that we could look at internally in private sector to maybe go do the same thing for ourselves. So I might not be on the warpath to go seek out every possible piece of legacy information that's now considered CUI, but choosing to mark it correctly before I disseminate it again would be in line with how the DoD is handling the same thing.
Oh, that's very interesting, because there's records implications there, right, as well, because there's the records we've already shipped off to NARA that we'll never look at again, right? And never in a world will we go back and take it. But there are certain records classifications where we store it internal to our organization for a period of time before you do that. And so I like what you're saying there, because I don't want to have to go back and look at that stuff every single time a new regulation comes out, or a new posture on even a new posture on an already written regulation, right? Well, oh, by the way, we're now interpreting it to mean this instead of that. And that happens every time I have a FSMA audit.
Sure.
And so I like that. So, because if I've already kind of created this archive, this stuff's off my plate. We're not actively using it, but we're maintaining it because it's a requirement, right, to maintain the government's data. I like what you said there, that we don't have to go, re-adjudicate all of our previous legacy content.
Yeah, what we encourage is a blended approach where if you can identify that at some point in time, CUI has been received by these systems or is subject to these business processes, we now know that that is the scope of our requirements for safeguarding, right? So we can confidently move forward with a NIST 800-171 implementation in the private sector, even though we don't know 100% of the data that is or is not CUI. We need to know the systems and the processes. Once we're working on that, we can still concurrently go back and try to identify legacy data, but we can do that knowing that the systems that are currently handling that data, whether marked or not, are safeguarding the data, and that's so critical.
So does this really start to encourage an organization to have good metadata hygiene?
I was thinking the same thing, by the way. Sorry. I was like, when you said it, I was like, yes.
Well, I think metadata is part of an overall data management strategy, right? Even the new updated guidance we just talked about, DODI 523024, specifically talks about metadata for the first time and how to handle that and how to make sure that all of your metadata is publicly releasable, so that you're not putting CUI in metadata, so that people can actually know whether they should open the document before they open it, or a tool can.
Oh, wow.
And that's really important. I do think that metadata is the key, because for me, working in manufacturing a lot, we have non-traditional file types. We've got CAD models, we've got telemetry data, we've got simulation data, and that's not a Microsoft Word doc. Right. I can't always put a visible label on it. And so metadata is the way that we can then manage those diverse data sets in the same way, with some of the same posture and business process.
So are there other best practices, because, CUI is one level of concerns, certainly within the government sphere, but there are other sensitive, maybe business sensitive, right? It's not quite CUI. I don't know. It's weird how we always like to try to peel that onion, because we don't want to classify something as CUI. Because then all the extra safeguards come into play, right? There's this kind of layers of of thing. Are there good practices within, certainly within Microsoft 365 for how we do that? I've heard you mention sensitivity labels. Is that the definitive methodology?
Yeah, we have to make sure that we don't give people decision fatigue or create a high error rate in their decision-making process. So whenever possible, we try to arrive at a conclusion where, if it's possible, not only internal corporate sensitive data, but data that's protected under non-disclosure, things that are export controlled, even though they might not qualify as CUI because they're not a contract deliverable, and also subsequently CUI. Could all of those data types nest under a single sensitivity label with the same information flow control policies? And could we basically have data stewards sort of preside over some of those data sets while they still operate under that sensitivity label? That's not always possible, but if we can consolidate the number of sensitivity labels and then use just simple, maybe non-automated document markings to further differentiate, that seems like an acceptable compromise right now. It reduces the error rate for how we're using the ones and zeros technology while still honoring the correct business processes. Because we don't want to overmark CUI, and we don't want to perhaps overlook safeguarding obligations in too broad of a label. But whenever we can get things that are generally kind of in that same, I guess you could say, moderate impact zone for confidentiality and other things, and use fewer labels to do that, that's always going to be leading to better outcomes.
Yeah, we have the same conversations. I have the same conversations on records and information management life cycle in general, not just the security side, which is, look, your old process, you had a tag or a label for every single piece, and I get why you went down that route. But if you start thinking about things from an outcome perspective, then you'll have a easier time managing things if your labels are based on those outcomes. You'll have less of them, which means you can organize and approach it better. And I really like that idea, is if it's possible, create a data steward. Have somebody who can help to manage, whether it's that geography of space or it's that label or that category of data. Have somebody that can, or a group of somebodies that can help do that for you. That's a really good way to kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Delegate that process, but still provide a centralized person to be able to support it. That's a really good idea. So, okay. This is the government community call. We've talked fairly generically from a technology perspective, but we've talked really heavily on the category of data. When it comes to Microsoft 365, what is available today for GCC or GCC High or even DoD, and what should they be looking forward? I'm sorry, this is putting you on the spot because we didn't prep you for this one. What should they be looking forward to coming to them to be able to support this conversation from a tech perspective?
Well, I think there's some tried and true technologies that you're going to see already in place, and I'll defer to the rest of the team here for maybe some specific roadmap items or things that are entering general availability within some of these different government clouds. Mm-hmm. But I mean, some of the tools that just no one really talks about or overlooks have been here for a really long time. Mail flow rules, like we have found so many times that email attachments over a certain size are often tech data packages. And if we can talk about the fact that I don't ever want an engineer getting that document directly in their inbox. I want it to go to a shared mailbox, and things like that can better shape the data flows. That's something anyone can start doing today. You can also have rules in some of the CASB type tools that exist within like Defender for Cloud, as those become available in different clouds for things like whether or not we want people to open links to sharing portals from some of our big prime contractors or agencies just based on the root URL. Things like that could maybe help us just make sure that the right people are pulling in the data from the correct sources on the right computers with the right account. Things like that can just reduce your overall footprint for data and maybe even retrain people to do the right things. When we talk about things like SharePoint and Teams, we're obviously huge advocates of assigning site level administrators and avoiding tenant level decisions for sharing, because then that idea of data stewardship can really start to take hold, and people can be tasked with the personal responsibility of owning this program, this project, and really know what the rules are contextualized for that program or that project. If you can back that up with a real information sharing agreement, go read NIST 847 for more information on that. But I mean, that's when people can take personal ownership of it. It's not out there. It's not that regulation off in the distance. It's right in front of them. And it's linking that up to the human behavior that really makes a difference. And then, of course, we just talked about Microsoft's Purview information protection. That's almost a cherry on top. If you can do all these other things to structure the data sets and structure the ways the data comes into the organization, we're really a big fan of things like service-side labeling and making blanket decisions targeted for a program, but then down selecting out certain documents that don't need to have that protection to go off to invoicing or to go off to other less sensitive business functions. All of the tools that are mostly in place today support that strategy. I don't think we have to wait for like the next bleeding edge, AI empowered, tool set that Microsoft is looking at in private preview right now, to necessarily make good decisions and structure our data today.
Yeah, I really like that reminder to go back to the older tools as a starting point. And that's one of the things that's always intrigued me as all of these capabilities come out. What are we doing from a baseline to protect things? And yes, these things are going to roll out. I like that, the cherry on top. But if you're not doing some of the basic things like email attachment scans, like the controls, those are great. Those are really great.
Yeah, it's definitely an iterative process, right? There's organizational maturity that goes into this process, and then the technology is really just allowing you to automate things that maybe you had to do manually the first few times to make sure it fits the culture, fits the business process. But once you can get that iterative process in place, the tooling really speeds this up.
As you're talking a lot about this, I wish there was like a blog or some sort of like technical like guide of like, hey, here's how you can do it in M365. And if there isn't one, then maybe one should be written. No, I'm joking. But
Sarah's not here. You're filling in for Sarah.
Sorry, I'm like advocating for her. Because I'm like, oh, I have so many. It's like the Cheesecake Factory menu, like got so many options and choices. Some of it's human, some of it's technical. Like, what do I pick that kind of fits my org? But this is really cool. This has been really, really informational, and just I know it's probably going to be hugely influential to a lot of orgs and a lot of people listening to this. Thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise today, Ryan. It was a joy to have you, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you again. Oh, and by the way, yes, how can people find you? Like, where are you at? Like, where can people kind of locate you on the interwebs?
Yeah, so our organization DefCert can be found at defcert.com. Of course, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so that's probably the preferred platform to track me down.
I did just actually ask you to connect,
so. And then do you have the magical blog that Reem was referring to?
I don't know that we have that magical blog. Sarah and I have talked before about doing some things on a few of the different tech community blogs and things like that. So we'll see if the public sector Microsoft blog can't start to heat up a little with some of those topics. Maybe we can do some guest authored posts there.
There we go. Awesome. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again, everyone.